I'm Bryce Futch,
I'm Spencer Amaral.
and this is The Way Forward. Welcome back to our latest episode of The Way Forward podcast. I'm Bryce Futch,
I'm Spencer Amaral.
and this is The Way Forward. We're really excited to be back with you again talking about the family. We feel like we left the last one off on a pretty heavy note. We got into some really
True.
good topics, but they were a bit heavy, and so we wanted to come back again and talk about what's next, the solution to the problem, the way forward, and kind of cast a vision for really what is a historic view of family that has been known to be good for society, and that just so happens to line up with the biblical ethic. So, Spencer, why don't you start us off by outlining a view of the family that's good for society writ large?
When you ask these big questions to start off, I feel like I'm doing my ordination exams all over again. For our purposes, talking about the family and its role in society, restate the question one more time.
Yeah, give us a view or vision of the family that is good for society writ large.
So the view of the family that is good for society is the one that you do see historically and traditionally, where the state has always recognized it has an interest in holding men accountable to be fathers to their children, to be husbands to their wives and the women that bring these children into the world. There's the natural messiness of that whole, children thing that has forced governments to always take a hand in recognizing the family and producing a stable family environment for the sake of the kids, if nothing else. This is also important from a societal level, because if the family's not being the basic building block of the society, then someone else is going to have to do that, right? And it turns into this question of who's going to be, carrying that load. And no one can really carry that load, as it turns out. If you don't have mothers and fathers loving and caring for their children, there's no real good substitute for that, as it turns out, when that becomes, widespread. So societally speaking, you need the family to do its job, to function as the family. And that means the state, in a certain sense, is bound to observe and affirm the goodness of the family and the natural need for the family unit to function. But it also means the state needs to honor the family and tread lightly around the family as an institution and not try to infringe on that. When you do, it's the problem from the other direction, where you're taking the responsibilities of the family away and trying to put them elsewhere in a place where they can't really be stewarded well.
Right.
Government does this all the time, right?
That's
Tries to steward.
It's already happening, right?
Yeah. We observe problems in society, and our knee-jerk reaction is the state has greater resources than us and they can handle this. Mm-hmm. And yet, when people try to offload basic responsibilities because we think, an institution or the state can do it better because they're bigger,
Right.
we miss what I think is so critical to the beauty of the family as a unit. The fact that God designed this thing so that in order for a child to even come into the world, you need a man and a woman to come together and love one another and stick it out together,
Right.
and be dedicated to one another over time, and model what love is to their child. I mean, if you're not loving the child doesn't even survive.
Right.
So there has to be love baked into it. There has to be dedication in order for the thing to survive, let alone flourish. But when you do see those things take root, you do see people flourishing in a community where they are genuinely needed. Mm-hmm. And boy, do we need moms and dads.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a massive change societally that has played a big part in this. Really, there's three of them. One, the sexual revolution that continues to seek to separate sex from childbearing, from children, and then the increase of materialism and the fact that I want what my parents had right out of high school, right out of college, materially. So we're seeking material wealth, and then also just a degradation of the current economy, right? I mean, our economy is in shambles. Money does not go anywhere near as far as it used to. Last year we got a cost of living adjustment raise, and it was less than half of the amount that inflation had increased just in the last year. So we see a lot more two-parent income households, right? And there's nothing wrong with two parents working, but when you are struggling to meet your bills, we talked about this before, there's a lack of margin. And so you don't have the time, right? Like the other day, we had a rare day off, and me and Brooke and the kids were just sitting on our front yard. And it was a wonderful time. We sat there for about an hour and a half, just hung out, played a couple games, just spent good quality time together.
Is that before or after you torched it?
That was before I torched it. Please don't tell my HOA. I'm sure they'll see it, but our HOA manager just happens to be out of town right now. So there's no Big Brother's not looking over my shoulder, and my neighbors were complicit. So anyway, so I think it's just our current culture has put up so many of these roadblocks for a thriving family, right? That it's hard to reclaim some of these. But I think there's a number of ways we can do that. Some of it is realigning our values and our materialistic expectations for what is the good life, right? Is the good life to keep up with my neighbor and to have better cars and a nicer house, or is it to build stability for my family so that we can do things together and thrive? I think, too, culturally, we belittle the impact that mom and dad have on the kids for cultural growth and cultural satisfaction, right? So how many times have you gone into a grocery store and there's some poor mom who just can't control her kids, right? And we look at her with pity as, man, that must be so hard. I can't believe she's having to do this. But then selfishly, we're also kind of thinking, I wish I could just shop in peace, right? And we're not supportive of her desire to parent these kids.
Right.
But then if she decides that, she wants to be strict with them, we tell her, whoa, let's not do that. It goes back to men without chest, right? We laugh at her and we're shocked to find traitors in our midst. We tell people that, kids are a good thing, and then they inconvenience us as strangers and we're upset about it.
Right.
And then parents try to parent, and then we get on to them. Now, we don't do this because I think we think rightly on these things, but societally, this is what we do, right?
Well, a through line that connects those things that occurred to me as you were saying it, I think is like a lot of the progressive notions, the assumptions that the culture is acting upon.
Yes. And
I think one of the most dangerous and harmful among them is the assumption that things ought to be easy.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? So whether that's assuming that people are basically good and everyone should just basically get along by default, Yeah.
Spend any amount of time with a 2-year-old and you realize that this is not how life works.
The economy, right? Work, managing a household, raising your children, assuming that anything about life is easy, at the very least is going to set you up for a great deal of disappointment.
Yes.
Right? But at the same time, I think it's a total failure to call the best out of people and affirm the fact we need you. There is work to be done. There's a good fight to be fought. You are crucial to this endeavor.
Yeah. And I think we'll bring up some topics. I would like to transition into how the church kind of speaks into this and plays a big part in this. For the overall view of our podcast, we've been trying to figure out how to make sure we have, well, not make sure, but how we have good, clear content lines, right? This week we're talking about the family. Next week we're going to talk about the church. But really, while there is sphere sovereignty, it is very much a Venn diagram, right? It all goes together. So I think this is one of the things that my wife really loved when we came to Christ the King in Marietta, and some of that we're echoing with the church plant here in Canton, is that, children are an important part of the life of a church. And a crying child, to quote one of my heroes of the faith, who I think got this one wrong, who used to say that children are like New Year's resolutions, they're meant to be carried out. And that's just not the case.
What?
Yes. Now, to be clear, he didn't say that in a church context. He said that in the context of a live performance that was being done. That was not
carried out. Okay,
it was not within the church walls. Just to be clear, but that's the way we treat them, right? Like we have the viewing room over to the side for mom to take baby when baby gets upset, and There's maybe a one-way mirror where we can't see them, heaven forbid, but they can see the service, or there's just a TV there. And we talk about the fact, like, we justify it with the idea that we need to get rid of distractions, right? But children and a crying child is not a distraction, right? It's a reminder of life. It's a reminder of why Christ came. It's a reminder of how Christ came. It's a reminder of the fact that we are in this together as a whole body, and the whole body looks differently depending on what stage of life you're in, right?
Yeah. And the whole pushback against distractions comes from a pretty modern idea that things are most real when they're registered in your perception,
right,
etc. And we, there's a whole philosophy behind that I detest. But.
Well, and I think at its core, it's selfishness. It says that I am more important than the needs of my neighbor. And if I am inconvenienced, then the other person is in the wrong. And that's just not true.
Right. I mean, you have instances pop up all the time. You mentioned the mom in the grocery store, but this happens at church constantly, where you notice a kid being a pain to his or her parent. And most people think that what they're supposed to do is, like, remain uninvolved. And I think this comes from a variety of places, some better than others, but there's also just a cultural sense of which it's almost like family relativism, right? They have their way of parenting, and I have my way, and we're totally disconnected, and I'm not going to get involved in any way. It's like sphere sovereignty. They're the parents, yes. But if you notice a mom having a hard time, why would you choose this instance to say, I will not help my fellow man?
Correct.
In any other given situation, we offer ourselves. How can I help, right? Yeah. Could I be of assistance? And it's pretty easy. Like, you need a distracted 2-year-old. Some new person shows up. Like, all you got to do is talk to the kid, and you can be like a huge hero in the situation, right?
Yes.
But no, like, we won't even try to get involved. It's a strange disconnect to me in that we won't help one another in raising our families. Yeah. And discipling our kids.
And 30 years ago, you mess up at little Johnny's house, and little Johnny's mom is going to pick you up and spank you, and your parents are going to say thank you.
Yes,
right?
She did it as a service to your parents.
Yeah, right? And now your parents are never going to let you go play with little Johnny again. They might call Child Protective Services. Like, it's insane.
Yeah, I love, and Bailey and I commonly repeat this to people, but we love the Jordan Peterson idea about you cannot let your child be someone that annoys you. Right. One of the greatest things you can do for your kid and for the world and everyone who will ever interact with your child is make sure that you send a likable person out into the world.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, if their parents can't stand them, why do you think the world's going to be kind to them?
Right.
So, yeah, we want to parent our kids in such a way that they can function and be integrated, whole, healthy members of society.
Right.
That it speaks to the heart of what the family is aiming at.
Absolutely. And I do think it's an interesting disconnect, like you said, that we choose these moments not to help our neighbor, but yet the same people who would be opposed to little Johnny's mom spanking your child are the same people who say, but it takes a village to raise a child. Like, this is the village we need, right? We need the village of, these are the people, like, the interconnectivity of life, right? The fact that this person is my neighbor. I also happen to go to church with them. Our kids are in school together. We're on the PTA. We're connected. We're not just random individuals that happen to be in proximity to each other. Right?
That's such a great point, because that is very much the egg, right? Egg chicken discussion about where do you get this kind of village from, and does it take this kind of a village to produce parents that are willing to, come alongside one another in raising their kids. And I do think you have to trust someone before you would ever want them to lay a hand on your kid, right? For sure. You would have to know them really well. And I mean, this is where, in the kind of dream world where we live on the same street, we walk, 2 blocks to our church, where we see each other commonly and we're involved in, life together. We're praying for one another. We know what we're struggling with. They know that I'm praying for my, toddler because he's learned a bad word and he's not listening very well. Yes. And they know how to come along and help me in that when they see stuff going wrong.
Brooke and I were, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Brooke and I were talking about this the other day. The fact that our generation, millennials, Gen Z, younger millennials, well, I'd say even older millennials, give their parents and people of their parents' generation a hard time for unsolicited parenting advice. But the internet and social media was not a thing, right? So if somebody didn't come up to you and give you unsolicited advice on how to help your kid, you just wouldn't know.
That's a great point.
Right? You'd have no idea that, oh, if I change this habit, maybe they'll change this way.
What is social media other than unsolicited advice?
Right? About everything. But yet we flock to it.
So I think millennials are just, we're overwhelmed with unsolicited advice now, thanks to social media.
Right.
That's a great point, though. I mean, wherever that generational shift happened, that's a distinct break from the past and the ways in which generations have been leaning upon one another.
Right, which then creates a less connected life, right? So not only are we not connected to them in relationship, now we don't even care what they think about anything, but yet we care what some stranger thinks online. So we're going to take the same picture 17 times because the first 16 weren't perfect enough.
Right. And I think you can trace the shift through, the 80s and new age parenting. Mm-hmm. The whole concept of it's new is like, I'm not interested in the way my parents raised me.
Right.
I would like to reject that and try something else. Which
is really interesting to me because I think most people are conceited enough to say, I turned out pretty good.
I know, that is the catch-22, isn't it?
Yeah, I turned out pretty good, but I don't want to do anything that my parents did.
No, it's I'm great. The real me is great.
Yeah, the real me is fantastic.
But I am deeply scarred nonetheless, right?
That's true.
I've overcome much adversity.
My victimhood has really made me a better person.
Despite my parents' best efforts.
Yes, I turned out perfect. Wow. So I think this is really good because the interconnectivity of life is something that helps all of our spheres, right? It helps the family, it helps the church, it helps government. Mortimer Adler, we'll talk about this a little further when we get into the government piece, but he's written some really great stuff on education and educational reforms. And he sees expanding public education with a lot of the programs we have now, kind of like Head Start, which has been a flop, but into that pre-K, almost daycare-esque education as a way to even the playing field. To say, you may not come from the best family. Your family may not be able to help teach you the alphabet before you start school. They may not be able to help you teach numbers before you start school. But we understand that, and we as a society want to help overcome that. So we're going to give you this opportunity to take care of your kids. So my question to you would be, how do you think that idea plays into, one, gets overplayed into the government is my village, and so the government is going to make up for my faults. But then also the need to say, we're not meeting this need as a society. There are way too many broken homes. There's way too many single moms who are just struggling to make ends meet, that don't have the time or the energy to be able to invest in their children like they would want to, right? It's not that they don't want to do it, it's that they don't have the ability or the opportunity to. How can we help pick up the slack? So where do you think the marriage between government and society comes in that way?
Could you shorten that question?
Sure. If we're trying to redeem the family, and we realize that we can only do that to the extent that the family exists and operates and works well, how do we help the families that don't work well? Is it, do we create I think to me, this is one of those things where the church should have the pre-K program and be invested in their community. Mm-hmm. And if the government's going to do anything, they're going to give the church some money for curriculum and to pay some people as a grant. They're not going to actually do the work themselves, right?
There's so many things that come to bear here, and I think I hear where you come from in some ways. We're thinking beyond just education,
correct?
Though, right? So, yeah, parents play such a huge role in their kids' education as it is. That goes without saying. But then you have just all the ways in which the family breakdown and all the other factors we were talking about earlier, mm-hmm. and previously, that the heavier conversation about challenges that families are facing, commenting on how prevalent two-income households are. And mm-hmm. If you have two-income households, that's less parental involvement,
right,
or presence at home, generally, unless you are able to work from home. But even then, we only have so much attention. Mm-hmm. We only have so much bandwidth and emotional energy to give. And so the more that the economy places burdens on the family, and parents, the less parents have for their kids. And that's just a difficult reality. Now, again, there's no easy way to do this. Life is just going to be difficult. And I do believe in encouraging people to rise to the challenge, because that's where we find the joy, right? Is in overcoming the challenges. But we want to make sure that our kids aren't making a whole lot of sacrifices along the way. So for the families that are really struggling, I think the church absolutely needs to be able to come alongside them. It's just like the whole thing of what neighbors or other people would you want to come alongside you in helping your family and your kids. And it's got to be people that you trust. And one reason why you might trust Bob across the street and his wife Jane is because you see them at church and you know them to be faithful people.
Right.
And you trust them on a deep level. You know, he's an usher. He counts the money after church on Sunday. Right. He's trusted. And you've seen him to be faithful in the little things. Yeah. So you might trust him with something as great as your child, right?
And yet at the same time, you're not expecting perfection out of Bob.
No,
right?
No. And you're not trying to cease being a parent because my neighbor's great. Right. So you can't lose the thread in either direction. Right. But you need to have a good relationship with somebody out there that you would trust to come alongside you. So to the extent that people are involved with the local church, but of course, if I'm not interested in visiting a local church and going in and making friends with people, I'm not going to have that as a resource, really. Right? It's going to be so hard for me to think of that as a resource. For people that aren't invested in local church, it's a massive resource that, to have a body of people, a community, it's a village, within the city that you would trust to come alongside you and help provide for whatever gaps there are in your household and its rhythms. The church can do that. It also isn't good. The church isn't good at going and, barging down doors and.
Right. Yes.
Not that that's what's required, but for people to know what they're missing out on is a big part of our evangelistic vision, right? Like, absolutely. Hey, do you guys see God is calling us to such a beautiful thing when he calls us into life in the church. It's life together. It's life in pursuit of Christ and becoming more Christ-like. That's where we flourish as individuals. It's how we flourish in relationship. It's how we cultivate a community of people that are faithful and trustworthy. And we lean on one another because we're all going to have our bad days. Right. And a hurricane comes along or a downturn in the economy. A war happens. Stuff happens. We need to be ready. And the readiness comes in capitalizing on the good times and the moments of peace when you can actually go sit on your front lawn with your family.
Right. Absolutely.
Or go get to know your neighbors and enjoy church on Sunday. So,
yeah, and I think that goes to a general cultural refutation of responsibility, right? We don't want responsibility for anything. And so when we look at life in the church, especially here in the Bible Belt, it's very cultural for many people. And I think cultural Christianity is a good thing. I think it's good to have a shared understanding of values, a shared definitions of things.
For sure, yeah.
It is good. But when you're trying to find a thriving body of believers, if you don't enter into that body with the understanding of I am responsible for the person the person next to me as a member of the same church, then you're not going to have the people that show up, for all of the things that having a life together in a church requires, right?
Yeah.
And if you aren't willing to take that responsibility for the neighbor, then don't be shocked when the neighbor doesn't take that responsibility for you, right?
Yeah.
Because I think we are inherently a lazy culture right now, and we want everybody else to care about me and care for me, but we don't want to do the work of caring for others.
Yeah. There's this image that I think of regularly in how people think of the church. And so I think of the Navy SEALs or Delta Force or Army Rangers or some elite unit,
This
right?
is probably one of the most stereotypical pastor things that you've done is comparing something in the church to an elite military unit.
Elite military. Yeah. Well, here's the thing. I think this is actually a bad thing in how it manifests itself often. If you can
hear that ding, that's our dishwasher. That's how you know you've made it when your dishwasher
very
sings
jolly
to you.
tune.
Yes.
I liked it. If I'm just a regular guy thinking about maybe I'll go look for a church, what am I thinking about what I'm looking for?
Yeah.
am I going to say, I'm going to go look for a really broken down, needy church that doesn't have anything figured out where I can pour in and invest? No one thinks that way. And most people say that would be a dumb way to think of looking for a church. I'm going to look for a really good church that's got it going on, filled with people that I think are really cool and hip, that I would like to be like.
Yes.
Right? So I'm looking for the Delta Force Church. The sad reality of that, though, is like, if you find that church, it's like, you know, Joe Schmo getting off the couch and thinking he could jump in and be an Army Ranger. Like, no, you actually don't fit in there.
Right.
At least if that's the parameter. If that's, you must be this cool to be a member of this thing, we're always going to aspire like beyond ourselves. And we're hoping that they're gracious enough to accept us as we are. Right? So there's that. But the other sad irony is like, you actually meet a Navy SEAL or an Army Ranger, and that is the opposite of the way they function on the team. And in fact, when Navy SEALs are being selected, it's not just whoever can do the most pull-ups, you're in. It is not that at all. What they're selecting for is guys who know what it is to be a member of a team, which means knowing what it is to look at the guy to your right and the guy to your left and make sure I'm not getting home without them.
Right.
No one gets left behind. Because this isn't a bunch of disconnected individuals here. This is a team. That's what the church needs to be.
Yeah.
It's really hard for people to understand that without, you know, how do you get Navy SEALs? People don't just walk in off the street. You go through all the other levels of training, and you learn what it is to make sacrifices together. You learn what it is to train and bleed and sweat alongside other people. And it's a wonderful thing when you see people do that and make sacrifices for one another on each other's behalf. The church needs to be a place where that's commonplace. But we have a hard time actually committing to anything as modern Americans, don't we?
Yes, we do.
We don't want to commit to relationships. That's why hinge culture is a thing, right? Sadly. We don't, I mean, we have to convince people to be committed to their own parents and their own children, their own communities, to come on out of their apartments once in a while and notice that they have neighbors. Not to throw everyone under the bus, but like there's so many things screaming for our attention and promising us beautiful distraction.
Yeah.
It's like a pleasure machine, right?
Right.
That's what we have now with the internet and social media and Apple Vision. Is that what it's called?
I think so. And Prime, Amazon Prime.
The goggle stuff?
Yeah.
The Prime that I don't have to leave my house to go shopping.
Well,
I can bring.
Amazon has glasses now as well. They just came out with.
Yeah, I mean, we are building the pleasure machine as fast as we can. So it's no longer a hypothetical of like, would you rather live in the real world or have a machine that you hit a button and you feel the way you want to feel?
And I think that goes back to the idea of moderation and self-discipline, right? But at the same time, I don't think we're not Luddites, right? We don't reject technology. We don't just reject those things out of hand. Because I think a great example of this within the context of the family is all of the children's shows that are out there today that you can just plop your 1-year-old in front of, and the TV will babysit them for you because they keep them 100% locked in, and it's just destroying. Like studies are showing that it's destroying your attention span. It's weakening their mind. Yeah. But if you use it in moderation, programs like Miss Rachel are phenomenal, right? Like my almost 2-year-old can count to 20 and can say all of her ABCs.
Nice.
And now I think a lot of that's due to the fact that she spends nearly 12 hours a day with her grandmother, right?
Yeah.
But what do we use as a tool to fill in the gaps? Something like Miss Rachel. It's for limited amounts of time during the day. It entertains her. It gets her exposure to other things. And so I think we're a gluttonous society, right? We always want more than our fair share of everything. And we're selfish in that way. And so instead of using these tools to make life better...
Sadly, that is definitely true to an extent, but at the same time, I think if it sounds like you or I are just like super down on people because they can't figure it out.
We're down on ourselves. Like we know
I
that
think
this
what
is
we're
where
really
we go.
commenting on, there's the flesh.
Right.
None of us is perfect, but that's what makes it all the more problematic that you have massive industries that are doing everything they can to force feed you everything you ever wanted. how are we supposed to say no to that? Like,
Right.
practically.
Sure.
If you're not coming into this thing well prepared and informed and braced for the difficulty of it.
Right.
So,
And for that conversation, you'll have to come back when we're talking about the institution of government and education specifically, and how we educate a moral society.
yeah.
That's gonna be a fun one.
Okay, we'll save that.
We'll save that. That's gonna be a really good discussion. No, I think this is great. I think again, a lot of these conversations, like we said, are meant to be aspirational, right? We take a minute and we talk about where are we currently, and then we talk about where do we want to go, right? Because you do have to have that end goal in mind. And
Yeah.
I think I remember it came up today in a group chat that I'm in, but one of my favorite clips from a TV series is it's one of the opening scenes of The Newsroom, which was written by Aaron Sorkin.
Is this the one with Jeff Daniels?
Yes. Yeah.
That infamous scene that everyone loves sharing.
Dude, it's so good. Oh my gosh. It's great because it's so true, right? Like if
You like that scene where he says America's the worst thing
Yes.
ever? Okay.
But to be clear, it's because it's not. He doesn't say it's the worst.
He says we're number one in all the bad things. And
we're not where we are not where we should be, and we are not where we have the potential to be. Right. The idea is the founders have given us such a great system of government that if we can just hold our own attention span for 30 minutes over the course of human history, we have the ability to accomplish incredible things, right? The fact that, what would it be, 60 years ago, the President of the United States stood up and said, by the end of the decade, we are going to put a man on the moon, and by God, we did it, right? That couldn't happen today, and it couldn't happen for a variety of reasons. America is no longer a leader in education. We're no longer a leader in economics. We're no longer a leader in production. We're no longer a leader in technology. We are slumping towards mediocrity. And I think that's because the family is broken down to the state that it's broken down, right? I think it's the bedrock of our society is the family. So the family has the ability to be incredible, to be a place where children are invested in, children are loved, children are educated, your neighbor is taken care of. You have these ties that bind for civic responsibility, for moral responsibility, for the furthering of your beliefs and your values in your society, if we can just take responsibility for ourselves, right? If we can embrace responsibility, embrace the hard parts of life, there is untold stability, there is untold fulfillment, there is untold joyfulness that is on the cusp, that is within the grasp, if we can just do the hard part, right? Heard a quote the other day from a guy that runs a program. Anyway, he said, if you can learn to suffer, you can have anything in life that you want. And it's very true. If you can learn to suffer, then the world is your oyster, right? Now, all of that needs to fit within a biblical worldview, and there's a lot of clarifying that can happen there.
Well, I would add a caveat to that. It's no one has a choice about whether you're going to suffer or not.
Correct.
So the key word there is how
Yes,
to suffer.
absolutely.
If you can learn how to suffer and how ought we to suffer, well, the only way you can persevere in suffering
Right.
is, the picture of it is the resurrection, right? The one who endured the very worst thing that this world had to throw at him and rose from the grave. That's just inviting us as Christians into a walk with our Lord wherein we can suffer through the very worst things this world has to throw at us because they do not have the trump card in their hand at the end of the day. They do not have the power. Christ does. And for those who are in him, death never has the final word. So, yeah, that how we suffer part is so critical because, man, this world is hard and everyone's going to suffer.
Yeah.
It's do we suffer in faith with hope, or do we suffer alone and hopeless?
Yeah. To quote that classic hymn of the faith, I've read the back of the book and we win.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I loved everything you said about the family. There's a flourishing that is only possible when you have people genuinely living into their God-given purpose, right? Genuinely living out these virtues of what is truly good and beautiful. in their family and how they relate with one another. And at the end of the day, the highest virtue is love.
Mm-hmm.
Paul put it very bluntly, without charity, all this is nothing.
Mm-hmm.
The family is the perfect picture where you see that manifested first, and then that connects to later on being the kind of person who can walk into a church and
Yes.
just sacrificially love the person to your left and to your right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's because you come from a family where you understand what it is to be loved.
Right.
And I mean, that mirrors the relationship we have with Christ, right? We love because he loved us first.
Mm-hmm.
We learned to love because our parents loved us before we had the capacity to know they were there.
Right.
And we learn in their model about what family is, what relationships ought to look like, how we deal with conflict, how you deal with dysfunctionality, because it will happen. The suffering
Right.
will happen.
just a
The
matter of time.
dysfunctionality will happen.
Yeah.
But how do you suffer through it?
Mm-hmm.
Is it with Christ at the center, or are you trying to do it alone
Right.
in your own perfection, in your own righteousness? That is a recipe for disappointment.
Indeed it is. Well, I think this has been good. I think hopefully listeners will feel like this is a more cheery episode and one that provides some hope and the fact that we're not doom and gloom.
Yeah.
But you do need to take stock of where, in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you're at and you have to know where you came from, right? So we've talked about those two things, and now I think we're on the move in the right direction.
One last word on this.
Please.
I think so much of this, it could even sound like doom and gloom to be like, man, we got to buckle up and do the really hard things. But come on, what are we talking about? We're talking about playing with your 3-year-old.
Yes. Getting up, putting your phone down.
We're talking about teaching them the alphabet and watching them grow and like cheering them on as they learn how to run
Yeah.
track and showing up to their baseball games. What better part of life is there?
Yeah. How is that not the good life? How is there a better option
Now,
available?
we have to be realistic.
Now, come on, that can't be as fulfilling as walking your dog that has its own little sweater when you're 73 into your studio apartment. That's
If there's one thing that's clear, people that are disconnected from the life of the family, they're miserable because life apart from the family is corrosive.
and they're
Just like life apart from God the Father
absolutely
is corrosive.
yeah.
A life that is only centered around me is corrosive.
And I don't want to come across as being too harsh on these folks. I think a lot of them have bought into the lie that society has fed them, right? Society has fed them the lie that this individualism of me first is going to be the end all be all, and it's just not true.
I don't hold people really that guilty. My job is to reach out to the lost, right? So they're first and foremost in my heart. And when it comes to dealing them with compassion and trying to see them as Christ sees them, they're never the enemy. At the end of the day, they're why we're out here.
Right.
But for the lost, you're starting off with people who are just not perfect, to put it lightly, right?
Sure.
Subject to temptation and sin and all the corruptions of the world, and we're not really great at withstanding that, as it turns out. But furthermore, the culture, to the extent that it's turned away from God and tried to come up with alternate definitions of freedom, and you mentioned before we don't handle responsibility well because we think of it as the antithesis of freedom.
Yes, absolutely.
So you just start setting up alternate theories of what is ethical and what is the good life and how ought I deal with the situation. And pretty soon we're cheering for people, for what? Living my best life now and putting myself first and building my own little kingdom around myself as if there is any fulfillment in that. And there's just not at the end of the day. So the best way that I know of to love people is to remind them that we flourish together. So I am here for you. And I'm going to do my best to be like Christ to you. And the best gift I can give you is Jesus and the love of Jesus that I have received in abundance, because he's calling everyone back to the banquet and into the family. And we all need that. We do. We have to eventually, I think, discover our need for that.
Yes.
Some people learn it, through the long, painful path, and other people are a little more intellectual. Anyway, God's got a story that he's writing in everyone's hearts. But I think back to the very beginning, empirically speaking, it is so plain to see that a healthy society requires healthy families.
Yes, Absolutely.
Just like a revolution, chaos and anarchy kicks in when like 10% of the people stop obeying the laws. Mm-hmm. Right? The American Revolution, we won. Only a third of the population was avowedly patriot. Mm-hmm. So, by all means, this tells you how many solid people and amazing families there are out there. But the fact of the matter is, like, you need your whole society to be shaped by healthy families. Mm-hmm. And it shouldn't be enough for us if, like, 92% are doing great. The 8% that aren't are suffering, and we ought to be grieving with them for everything that they're missing out on.
Absolutely. Yeah, and which goes back to Edmund Burke, right? The little platoons. And the family is the first of the little platoons for the formation of your society, for the formation of your culture. This has been really good. I appreciate the thoughts.
Thanks, Bryce.
Yeah, this has been solid. Well, hopefully, like we said, this has been a little more cheery, a little more hopeful.
I'm so cheery and so hopeful.
Me too. I'm going to go get another cup of coffee. But thanks so much for joining us again today on our latest episode of The Way Forward. We'll be back soon. Hey everybody, this is Bryce Futch, host and creator of the Way Forward podcast, and I wanted to take a minute and tell you about our sponsor for Season 2, Stand for Georgia Values Political Action Committee. They exist to ensure that every vote in Georgia is an informed vote, providing clear, concise, and accurate information about the issues and candidates shaping our future. They do some incredible work finding phenomenal candidates at a local level throughout North Georgia, and then also doing some work across the state as well. But you can find out more information about them at standforgeorgiavaluespac.com. We're incredibly grateful to have them as a sponsor. Like I said, not only have they sponsored Season 2, but they're going to continue to sponsor the podcast moving forward. So hopefully you'll be getting some more regular content from us. Be on the lookout for that next month. We're very excited for what is to come on the way forward. Full disclosure, I do serve as their executive director of that organization and their partnered 501c3 Stand for Georgia Values Foundation. But thanks again to Stand for Georgia Values PAC for their sponsorship. Please check out their website and be involved with them so that they can continue to support the work that we do here at The Way Forward. Thanks for listening.